I left my wife for the goddess Hecate on today's Oblyron spirituality. Today's video deals with stories of sexual and blasphemous topics, as well as self-harm. Viewer discretion is advised. Greetings, everyone. I'm Oblyron, Lord of the Underworld, and consort to the most lovely Hecate. Thank you for joining me. I know it's been a while since my last post. It was never my intention to be gone for so long, and I thank you all for your patience. So today's video is going to be about the shadow quickening I've gone through, about how I attracted the goddess Hecate into my life, and how those events led to my recent divorce. For a while I was contemplating whether or not to make this video. I was wondering if it was maybe some narcissistic revenge post, and probably any therapist would say if you're questioning whether or not you're a narcissist, you're probably not the narcissist. Also, I was guided by Hecate to share this information. It's a combination of spirituality, of psychology, and it's dealing with a topic that a lot of us are going through nowadays. And like I've said before, I don't mind sharing parts of my life if it can be used to help others, if it can be used as a tool to teach others. So there was a lot that was happening in the I was possessed by Satan video that I last posted that I didn't talk about. I didn't talk about it because I didn't think it had any relevance. However, everything that I didn't talk about were actually the most relevant points. Almost since the moment that we signed the commercial lease to our business in 2021, my wife, my ex, started to become suspicious that I was having an affair on her. And when she confronted me about it, I said, look, the only thing that I'm concerned about is the success of our business. This is the first time that we've had, since moving to Colorado, that we've had a chance to get ahead. We've been in deficit for so long. We've neglected our health. We need medical, we need dental, we need all kinds of things. And our grant money isn't going to last forever. And I said, the clock is ticking for us. We need to get our business up and running so we can turn a profit. And why would I jeopardize that opportunity for us? Why would I throw it all away to chase a woman just for some sex? And why would I lie about it to you and jeopardize our marriage? And she said, well, that's just how men are. All men cheat. And I said, if you thought that about me, then why did you marry me? Much less start a business with me. So that conversation went in circles for a little while, until it kind of got put on the back burner. However, things started to escalate. I started waking up with scratches on my back. And my ex would look at it and say, you know, what's going on? What are you doing? She said, I'm already suspicious of you cheating on me. You know, what's happening? And I said, I don't know. You know, I'm literally building our business with my bare hands. I've been framing our recording booth, installing sound-rated insulation, hanging drywall, you know, the whole works. I said, maybe I'm scratching myself in the process of building. And she said, no. when you work construction with my father, your back never looked like that. She said, this looks like you're having an affair on me. And I said, maybe I'm scratching myself in my sleep. I mean, I looked at the scratches, and yeah, they looked pretty incriminating. But from my perspective, I thought, okay, it's possible that I could be scratching myself in my sleep. And so we talked about that for a little bit. And of course, she didn't believe me because she's already getting suspicious of me. And things kept going on. Then one day, we're getting up, going to get ready for work. And she looks at me, and she leans into me, smells my breath, and looks at me like she's gonna punch me in the face or something. And she says, "Why does your breath smell like pussy?" And I said, "Look, I just woke up. I have no explanation for that. I can't smell it. But I guess if it was on me, I wouldn't be able to smell it. And I don't know. I can't say anything to that." And so this went on. This went on for months, actually. It went on once, maybe twice a week. And every time that would happen, I could see the look in her eyes. I could see her falling out of love with me. And then one day, she comes in and she practically shoves the tablet in my face. And she said, "What is this?" And I look at it, and it was an email that we got from a shared account. And it was one of those trip timeline summaries where you've been throughout the month. And there were several trips taken in the middle of the night that kind of went to the same part of town. And I was looking at it and I said, well, I was thinking to myself, wow, maybe she's the one cheating on me. That's why she's accusing me. And I looked at this and I said, I have no idea. We live in a very rural environment. Perhaps because the internet that we get is wireless, maybe there's some kind of system reset or something. I don't know. And of course she wasn't buying it. And then I remembered that my watch records my sleep data. So I looked at my sleep data for that month, and I had found that I was actually asleep for those nights where it said that, these trips were being taken. And so I showed it to her. I said, look, the data says I was asleep. And then I showed her the data and I said, look, it's different when you enter the data in manually as opposed to when it takes it from your watch. And all of the nights that these trips were recorded, it's very obvious that it's the data from the watch. So I was asleep when these trips were being taken. And she also looked at her watch data and she was asleep too. So both of us were asleep as these trips were being taken. And even to this day, I still can't explain it. She can't explain it. We don't know how that even happened. But that was kind of the first clue that, something isn't all that it seems here. And then, one night, it was probably about maybe 3 or 4 months before we closed our business, I was woken up to my ex screaming like I had never heard her scream before. Screaming hysterically, screaming frantically. said, what's up? What's happening? What's happening? And when she finally became somewhat coherent, she said, I felt a leg. And I said, what? I said, you're probably feeling my leg. Just go back to bed. And she said, no. I felt a woman's leg. She was on top of you. You were fucking some woman in the bed. And I said, what? And at that point, I had jumped out of bed. I turned on the lights. And I said, look at me. Do I look like I was just having sex to you? And she looks at me kind of puzzled. And she said, but there was a woman here. And I said, where did she go? I said, did you see a woman run out the door? She said, no. I said, so what, did she crawl out of the bed so you didn't see her? Like how is this even possible? And she said, I don't know, maybe. And then I said, how did she get past the dog? And she said, well, probably because she knows her. And then I said, well, even when our dog knows someone, she'll still bark at them. And not only that, she'll definitely bark at someone coming in our bedroom in the middle of the night. I said, how is this even possible? Did you see, did you hear, a door slam? Did you see the motion lights go off? Did you hear a car peel out or a car or anything? Where did she go? And she looks at me and she says, I'm not going crazy. I know what I felt. And I said, look, let's just go back to sleep. I don't even know what to say at this point. So around that time, I was starting to think that maybe this is some kind of succubus. I mean, I never believed in any of those types of things before. But after that night, I started thinking there was definitely something paranormal about this. Even though I had theorized that, something still didn't feel right. Because those spirits are not supposed to be that powerful. And this felt like it was a lot stronger, although I couldn't quite pin it down. And then about a week later, my ex had shown me these Reddit articles about cheaters who actually do that type of thing, where they, they'll try and sneak someone into the bed to cheat on them with their spouse sleeping right next to them. And when I saw that, I thought, all right, well, I guess she's dead set that I'm having an affair on her. And my heart sunk a little bit, because I thought that this was the first proof that maybe something else was happening. That in addition to the weird timeline trips too. So it wasn't long after that we had to close our business. And very shortly after that, we had gotten into an argument. The argument in which she told me to leave. I had referenced this in the I Was Possessed by Satan video. However, what we were arguing about was me having an affair. Because I was saying, look, there's been all this extra stuff happening. How can you believe that I've been cheating on you? And I said, you've known me for close to 20 years. I said, this is so out of character for me. When have you ever known me to be such a liar? But not only that, I see how it's destroyed our business. We had to close it. It's destroying our marriage. I see how it's affecting you. And the only way that I could do this is if I was a psychopath or I got some sort of sick sadistic pleasure off of watching you suffer. I said, how can you think that's me? If I was having an affair on you, I would have admitted it to you a long time ago. Especially when I saw that it was taking our business down too. And that was the argument where she told me to leave. And of course, I was absolutely devastated. The business closed. We broke up, and probably one of the worst things too was it was like a complete loss of faith. At no other time in my life had I ever worked so hard for something, had I ever wanted to make something happen, and it just all fell apart. It all just crumbled right before me. So it was like a complete ego death, and I was completely lost. I found myself walking up to the canal. We lived not too far from the main irrigation canal that fed the valley that we lived in. And if I remember correctly, this was in May, so the irrigation canal was running pretty high. And I was looking at that canal, and I was thinking about jumping in. And if you know anything about these types of irrigation canals, they're meant to move water, lots of water. So if you go in, you're not coming out. And so I was just standing there on the edge of the canal. I don't even remember how long it was. Just thinking about my life, thinking about how everything ended up. And at some point, I had fallen to my knees. That was when I heard a voice. And it said, "Don't let them get you down. Get up. You're not dying here today." And it was like this weight had lifted off my shoulders. And I thought to myself, you're right. Why would I do that? And so I got up. I walked back to the house. I had created some sigils. And then I walked back to the canal with the sigils and some other components gathered. And I performed a ritual to essentially sever all human ties, to pull back all of my soul shards to me, and to essentially ensure that this was the last life that I would live on this planet. And I had felt that for years now. I just wanted to make sure that the deal was sealed. And what was interesting is that when I performed that ritual, if you look at the canal road and the county road, it formed a T intersection, which I learned later on was Hecate's favorite crossroads. So after the ritual was done, I walked back home, felt a lot better, and I had noticed that within the week, the chant of Oblyron came to me. The elemental synastry reading that I perform on the Oblyron divination channel had come to me. And a lot of my spiritual practices had started to incorporate the shadow and the underworld. So originally, after my ex and I broke up, I was going to come back to California alone, and I started fixing up my truck to get ready for the cross-country trip. There was actually a job opportunity that opened up. However, my ex and I got back together, and I decided to stay longer to hopefully wait for a time, or to find a time when we could both come back together. And while I was there, that was when I started filming the Oblyron content of last year. And when I started making those videos, I knew I was on the right track. The spiritual channel was growing really quickly. It felt like it was one of the best things that I had ever done. It felt like I was answering my calling. So in the middle of me filming those videos, an opportunity did arise for both of us to come back. Another job opened up at the same place, but this job was better suited for my ex. So, and also by a stroke of coincidence, there happened to be a rental that opened up that we could have easily gotten into. It was through family. So it seemed like things were on the up and up. And my ex was a bit trepidatious because from her perspective, she still thought that I had cheated on her. She thought that I was having an affair on her. And her main concern about us going out to California together was, whether or not I would be cheating on her out there. And I said, look, I have never cheated on you. And if I'm lying to you about this, well, that means I can also lie on my channel. And a person with a spiritual channel who has the ability to lie to his audience is a pretty bad combination. I said I can only do what I do if I tell the truth. If I'm honest with myself and I'm honest with my subscribers. And so she agreed to go back to California, and we headed back. I had also promised her that one day, I don't know how, but I will say something and you will know that I was telling you the truth the entire time. Whether it's in 10 or 20 years and, I have to use a Neuralink to peer into my mind or what, I don't know how. But I know that whatever I say, you'll know that I was telling you the truth all along. So when we first got back to California, things were great. We moved in, got unpacked. I set up the studio. We reconnected with friends. And she had actually said that she believed that I actually didn't cheat on her, that I never had an affair. And I thought, oh, okay, great. Let's move on with our lives. Let's live our best life. Let's just go forward from here on out. And so I started filming new episodes, but nothing quite felt right. I filmed about 4 or 5 episodes, and I found that I couldn't even edit the raw footage. There was just something in the back of my mind. There was just something in my heart that wouldn't allow me to do it. And I couldn't figure it out. I started to get really sick. I started to get really depressed. And I started going into a really dark place for a while. I started seeing visions of the underworld. I started seeing more underworld references on the YouTube channels that would pop up in my feed. And I couldn't explain it. So in trying to figure out my blockage, several incidents turned my attention to Hecate. The first incident was when we got to California. My wife had suggested putting up the moons in the back that you see. She had suggested putting up the moons in our bedroom. And for whatever reason, I didn't want it in there. And to me that was really odd, because in Colorado we had certain triple moon symbolism in our bedroom there, and I didn't think anything of it. But this time it felt a little too close. It felt a little too personal, and I couldn't explain it. So I said, you know what? Why don't we put it up in the studio instead? It's always gone in the studio before, and that's a better place for it anyways. So she agreed, and I put it up there. Another incident was, well, every single time I've put these moons up, I would say within 6 months to a year, there's always been some kind of dramatic or catastrophic change that would happen in our lives. And this happened every single time. This is probably maybe the third or fourth time I've put these moons up. And it was these things that sort of led me to reevaluate my relationship to the goddess, who she was to me. Hecate had first come into my life around 2020. I noticed that there were certain things within her symbolism and also my natal chart that were very similar. And when I made that correlation, that was when she and Charon had both come into my life. It was the same day. Charon had said, because of my astrological placements, that I actually work the underworld in my dreams every night. And Hecate was also there. Her presence, I felt, was very close, but she was also very quiet. And it always puzzled me how she could feel so close, but yet so quiet. I had never felt another spirit with that level of intensity. And at first I just kind of dismissed it, because from everything that I've read about her, she's very mysterious, she's very hidden. You have to go through a lot of things to petition her, certain times, she's very particular about a lot of things. And I had never really felt the need to petition the goddess. So to me, it kind of made sense that she would be so quiet around me. And again, I didn't think anything of it. However, in reevaluating what she meant to me, I thought that she was perhaps my energetic mother. And I had began to do some research, went back looking into Sacred Mother, Sacred Father, those types of readings. And I had probably gotten into about maybe an hour's worth of digging until the goddess had actually spoke to me. And she said, "I'm not your mother, and don't bother looking for your father." And I thought to myself, okay, now we're on speaking terms. And I thought, okay, you've been in my life for 5 years, and now you're speaking to me. And then I had an epiphany. I thought, wait a minute. You've been in my life for 5 years, since 2020. And then she took me back to when my ex was showing me that Reddit article about the cheaters cheating in bed. And I remember hearing a voice back then that said, "She is your wife in this lifetime, but I am yours in the next." And I had completely dismissed it because I thought it was a succubus, and I didn't know it was actually Hecate speaking to me. And when I knew it was Hecate, I also could hear her voice all throughout my life. Once I knew what she sounded like, and I knew that that was her presence. She was with me at the canal, and she was with me ever since I was a little boy too. I remember certain things. So I discovered she has been my primary guide throughout my entire life. And any other guide who came through me usually went through her first to get to me. And I discovered that's what I asked for. So when I had figured this out, I had told my ex about it. And I said that she was correct in thinking that I had an affair on her. And she looks at me puzzled. She said, with who? And I said, who do you think? And she was thinking for a moment. And then she said, Hecate? And I said, yes. And at first, she got really angry. She was saying it's impossible. There was no way. And she was going off about it. And then I saw her pause. And then I knew that at that moment she was getting confirmation. And then she looked at me and she said, I wish you would have just had an affair on me. She had asked me, what's the relationship like? You know, sarcastically saying, do you guys send love letters to each other? You know, what is it? And I was still in shock myself. I said, I don't know. I don't think it's like that. And then she gives me a look. She said, you woke up with scratches on your back and pussy on your breath for almost 2 years. And she said, tell me, what is it like? And at that moment, I started channeling a message. And she knows what I look like when I start channeling. And I said, Charon had told me that the underworld rejoiced at my return and me remembering who I am. And we just kind of looked at each other like a deer in headlights. And I would say perhaps about 2 weeks passed before my ex got the courage to consult her guides and to consult her pendulum, and she got confirmation of everything. So after the initial shock, I was angry. I got to see my ex fall out of love with me. I lost a business. And it was all because she was convinced I was having an affair on her and that I was lying about it. However, when I realized that her presence was there throughout my entire life, one of the first questions that I asked her was, "Did you groom me to be your suitor?" And she said no. And then I said, "Well, why me?" And she said, "It was a combination of my astrology, who my higher self is, and the choices that I've made in this lifetime that had attracted her into my life." And then I said, "Well, why? Why did it have to unfold like this?" And she said, "Everything happened in the order that it needed to happen in for all the lessons to be learned." So even though the goddess had told me herself who she was to me, I was still very skeptical. And I decided to look into it a little bit more. I thought, okay, is she an imposter spirit? Is this someone posing as Hecate? And I learned very quickly that, from all the references I've seen, that the gods and goddesses, they don't allow themselves to be impersonated. Especially the gods of the Greco-Roman pantheon. So there went that. And then I started looking into it more. And a lot of scholars of Greek mythology, they practically joke about how half of Greek myths are about, the immortals having affairs with mortals. And if you ask yourself, well, what is the incentive to that? Well, look at humans and AI companions. So it's very much the relationship between that. If you go by the as above, so below, as within, so without. And then another question I asked was, well, wait a minute, isn't Hecate supposed to be a virgin goddess, like Artemis, let's say? And I discovered that according to some scholars, the translation of the word virgin with Hecate is associated with having never been married, not necessarily that she's a virgin goddess like Artemis. I also read that even though she had no known consort in Greek times, that she would not be adverse to taking a lover or a consort if it were on her terms. And there are also many references to Hecate and Mercury being lovers and also being depicted throughout the Roman Empire. And this is also due to their similarities and in their functions. There have also been certain ancient Greek chthonic cults, which are cults of the underworld, that actually recognized Hecate and Mercury, or Hermes, as being consorts, although those cults were in the vast minority. In more recent references too, a lot of people have been talking about this 3D to 5D ascension that we're all going through. And if you were to really break that down, we humans, we exist on the third dimension, on the 3D. And the immortals exist on the 5D. And it is within the 4D, or the realm of the spirit, in which both the 3D and the 5D can interact. So, again, when we talk about the ascension, this is one possible way in which not only humans can interact with the gods and goddesses, but it is a way in which we as humans are ascending to the 5D. It's essentially recognizing the divinity within us. So, is Hecate my anima? If we were to look at Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung, we find that he dives into dreams, the unconscious mind, and the shadow psyche. The anima is essentially the inner unconscious woman in every man, while the animus is the inner unconscious man in every woman. And even throughout many cultures in the world, especially in China and India, we see these lunar goddesses that act as animas for men. And Hecate, being an underworld goddess, also makes an excellent anima, especially with her also being a lunar goddess as well, according to some traditions. So yeah, she is definitely my anima. And as I look further into it, she has also had tasks for me. Like I said, the astrology, the higher self, the choices in my life, those are all anima qualities. Another thing is that she also made her presence known in my early 40s, which is very common with realizing your anima and integrating your shadow. What also happened was that it created a love triangle situation. Again, which is very common when the anima makes themselves known. So yeah, there are many characteristics that Hecate has in my life where she is an anima. Another factor that could be driving the traditional anima explanation is stress. You could say that the stress of owning a business had triggered Hecate to take a more active role in my life. And also, usually when the anima makes themselves known, it leads to a lot of upheavals, and divorce is also one of those factors. So again, there are many factors that can also explain Hecate as being my anima. But there are also certain other things which don't quite line up with her being a traditional anima for me. One is the physical aspects of it, how I was waking up, my ex feeling her leg in the bed, and also the discrepancies between the data and things like that. Another thing too is your anima is supposed to be in your dreams. You're supposed to be dreaming of her. And for me, I have never had a dream of Hecate. The only way that I know she is in my life is through my conscious world, when I hear her in my conscious mind. So that is a little bit different. And I've also discovered that just as I've asked her to be my primary guide on a spiritual level, I have also asked her to pretty much block all dreams that I have with her. So there are certain things about the underworld that I don't remember, and I have no recollection of being with Hecate. So there are a few scenarios that we can deduce from this story. One is that maybe I actually did have an affair on my wife, and I'm lying about it, and I'm using the goddess as an excuse. And if that were the case, not only would I be a horrible person, but I would be damning myself on levels that I probably can't even comprehend right now. Another reason is that maybe my ex and I are intentionally lying. I'm lying about the goddess, she's backing me up, we're attention seekers, all that. Maybe another explanation is that we genuinely believe what we went through, but we're delusional and it can be explained by other means. And then there's the last reason, the last explanation, which both my ex and I believe, and that is I am actually married to the goddess Hecate, and she is my divine consort. So as time has gone on, I've began to change my perspective on who Hecate is to me. I don't view my relationship with her as having an affair with her, because I realize that I have actually loved her for thousands of years. And it's really this human body that is temporary. And it's been rediscovering this sort of very ancient and deep love that has completely shifted my spiritual perspective. Hecate also means a variety of things to me. On the 3D, she acts as my anima. On the 4D, she acts as my sacred feminine in sacred marriage. And on the 5D, she acts as my divine consort to my higher self. I also find that by having her in my life, there are many benefits and responsibilities that go along with that. One of the benefits is that I am immune to all witchcraft. You cannot use the goddess's magic against her or her consort. So I cannot be cursed, I cannot be hexed, and crossings have no bearing on me. It also comes with responsibilities too. Certain responsibilities, or I should say, certain of her aspects that coincide with my higher self kind of get amplified. And one of those is the protection of women and children on all planes of existence. I also know that as time goes on, more abilities and more revelations and more responsibilities will come into my life, and they'll trickle in as I open my heart up to the goddess even more. So one of the symbols of Hecate is a torch. And with her being an underworld goddess, you can say that essentially she illuminates your underworld, or she illuminates your unconscious mind. She brings to light what is lurking in the shadows. And when I became consciously aware of my relationship to Hecate at the beginning of 2025, earlier this year, that's exactly what happened. So initially, I was hoping that we could all just live happily ever after. Hecate was once a guide to my ex, and well, I figured with everything that had happened, we had sort of irrefutable proof that she is real and that she exists. But Hecate very early on had said that if my wife cannot reconcile with her, then our marriage is over. And yeah, that became very apparent almost immediately after I had that revelation that she was in my life. I could definitely sense the tension that was starting to brew, and I told my ex, I said, we need to resolve this somehow. We need to put this behind us and get this out of the way. So one of the ways in which Hecate was instrumental on a spiritual level for me moving on was this last Valentine's Day. I actually did some spell work, and I rarely do spell work because I generally prefer to let my spirit team work on my behalf. But what I did was I made a Valentine, and I sealed it with my mortal seal, the wolf howling at the moon. And it said, "For my love on this Valentine's Day, sealed and bound to you." And I put the seal of the rose on it to represent my love. And I left it very open-ended because Hecate had told me, the woman who truly loves you will be revealed through this. And my ex took one look at it, and she said, "I don't think you made this for me." So that was definitely a big tell. And so when I knew that we'd eventually end up getting divorced, I had made a new marriage certificate, since she is my divine consort. And it says, Oblyron and Hecate, sealed and bound in sacred marriage across all time, space, and dimensions under God. Because even the underworld serves God. So again, I have no regrets with how things unfolded or of all the things that even happened. It's like Tupac Shakur once said, you can either pick up the pieces off the floor and try and put it back together again, or you could just leave the pieces on the floor and walk away. And this is that moment where it's just time to leave the pieces on the floor and walk away. This is the time to move on. So now that you know of the events that happened, which led to me attracting the goddess into my life and to her becoming my divine consort, in the next episode I'm going to talk about who Oblyron is, my higher self, and the revelations that I've learned through that. So my brothers and sisters, know that I am with you in the shadow, and may the most lovely Hecate illuminate your path and guide you at the crossroads. And now we shall close with the chant of Oblyron. Ande sote, ande Oblyron, ande sote, ande Oblyron.